Well, the lectionary texts for today are these lovely post-Easter texts. One of them, which we didn't hear, is from Revelation 1. And in Revelation 1, it talks about Jesus as the firstborn of the dead. He comes with the clouds. God is Alpha and Omega. That would have made a good Easter sermon. Not talking on that one. Another text from the lectionary, which we also didn't hear today, is from John 20. And in John 20, Jesus' disciple Thomas comes to him and says, Jesus, I want to see the wounds. I want to see where you've been crucified. And he does. And Thomas gives this beautiful profession of faith and says, my Lord and my God. And that would have made a great Easter sermon. Not preaching on that either. Because you see, when I was looking at the lectionary text today, and I saw this text where Peter says, we must obey God rather than human authority, I said, ooh, yes, give me a little bit of a rebel. Because I have a teensy bit of a rebellious side too. And now for me, this often gets manifested in clothing. So when I was a young kid, my mom will attest to this, she could not keep a stitch of clothing on me, to the point that my grandmother went to my mom and said, Tash, you really need to keep clothing on Melly. Eventually, I learned, okay, I gotta wear clothing. But if I have to wear clothing, I'm not gonna match. So, florals and stripes, plaids and patterns and polka dots, it was a hot mess. And so I've calmed down a little bit, but as I hope you can see from my tight selection today, I still like being a little bit of a rebel. And so that means that as I saw the story of Peter, as Peter looked at the council and said, we must obey God rather than human authority, something resonated. And I think something resonated because what we find Peter doing is the story of the church throughout the ages. The story of people of God who say we must obey God rather than human authority, because the story of God is the story of life over death. And so this morning, what I'd like to chart out for us is starting with the story of Jesus, starting with the way in which Jesus says he must obey God rather than human authority by choosing life, seeing how that plays out in the early church, and then seeing how this continues to play out in our life as Christians today. So let's start. Let's start with Jesus. Jesus, you might remember from several of the stories in the Gospels that Jesus has no problem obeying God rather than human authority. All of the Gospels tell us this. In the Gospel of John, for example, Jesus heals a man who's been born blind. When? On the Sabbath. The Gospel of Luke has two stories, one of a woman who is bent over, one of a man who has this abnormal swelling, and Jesus heals both of them. When? On the Sabbath. The Gospel of Mark, Jesus encounters a man whose hand is shriveled, and Jesus says, we need to proclaim life over death and over destruction and sickness. And so Jesus heals the man when? On the Sabbath. So we have this pattern of behavior. Jesus, who could heal anytime, chooses to heal on the Sabbath. Jesus obeys God rather than any human authority. And it doesn't stop there. In the Gospel of Mark, we get an especially spicy Jesus, probably why I love the Gospel of Mark so much. In Mark, some leaders come to Jesus and say, Jesus, we are very concerned. See, your disciples, they aren't practicing the proper washing of cups and plates, and we know you're a good rabbi, and we know you'll want to correct this behavior. Won't you? You can almost hear the tone coming out. And Jesus says, well, I don't really see the problem here, right? They are obeying God rather than human authority. And in fact, Mark goes so far to tell us that Jesus, in doing this, ultimately declares all foods clean. Now, to us, this might not seem like a big deal, but to a first century Jewish audience where there are very clear rules of clean and unclean food, for a Jewish rabbi to say, they're all clean, would have been nearly blasphemous. But again, Jesus, in choosing life, in choosing the flourishing of humanity that can eat from all foods and be sustained, Jesus obeys God rather than human authority. And finally, the story that we heard last week proclaimed is the ultimate story of Jesus' rebellion. What else is pushing back against human authority than when the human authorities put you to death, refuse to remain dead? You had one job, Jesus. No, Jesus chose to obey God rather than human authority. And so it's perhaps no wonder that as we get to our story for today in Acts chapter 5, that the apostles who learned from this guy, they themselves have no problem saying we choose to obey God rather than human authority. Now, Donna had given us some really good context here. Thank you for that. Let me provide a little bit more context leading up to what we've got here. Peter and the apostles have been preaching for some time. They've been at this. They have been telling the good news of Jesus. They have been proclaiming healings. They have been performing healings. So in many ways, they are doing all the same sort of things that their teacher, Jesus, had been doing. They're following in his line. And they too, like Jesus, have gotten some stern warnings. Now, Peter, now other apostles, you can't be doing this. We have certain decorum. We have certain things that we expect. And going around and performing healings and preaching about Jesus, well, no, that's not quite how it should be done here. We need you to calm down a bit. And this results, as Donna had given us the context here, that they keep doing this. They are not restrained. And so eventually, fine, what do the human authorities do? Well, we put them in jail, because what else do you do with those who aren't obeying the laws? Well, they're about as good at staying in jail as Jesus is at staying dead. Instead, an angel comes to them, opens the prison doors miraculously, and tells them, okay, time to go back out, time to go keep preaching. And so they do. They do keep preaching. They go to the temple courts and they begin continuing to proclaim the good news of Jesus. And this is where our story for today starts. The chief priests, the leaders, come to Peter, come to the apostles, and say, we told you not to do this. Why are you doing the one thing you were told not to do? And this is where we get Peter's answer. We must obey God rather than human authority. And in this context, what obeying God looks like is making a choice for life rather than death, making a choice for hope rather than despair. Listen to what Peter says here. He says, we must obey God rather than human authority because you had him killed, but God raised him up. You hung him on a tree, but God exalted him at the right hand. What you have intended for death, God has intended for life. And this is good news. This is the good news that the message of Jesus is a message of hope, and that when we proclaim that we obey God rather than human authority, we are proclaiming that we believe in the power of life over death. Praise be to God. And this is a story that we just can't quite give up. Here, as a part of Willow Avenue Mennonite Church, we stand in a long tradition of Anabaptists. A tradition of Anabaptists who have said, you know what? We think Jesus had it right. We think Peter and the early apostles had it right. And so we too are going to obey God rather than human authority. When the human authorities tell us that we can only be baptized as infants, that that's the only thing that counts, we must obey God rather than human authority, and we will re-baptize out of profession of faith. And in the wars that have followed in the centuries since then, when governments have said to Anabaptists, you must go to war, you must fight, and you must kill for your country, Anabaptists have said, no, 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 we obey God rather than human authority, and what our God tells us is to turn the other cheek and to love our enemies. And in fact, we can even look at the 17th century book, The Martyr's Mirror, that collects all these stories of those in the history of faith who said, we must obey God rather than any human authority. This is a rebellion that's in our blood. Perhaps I'm the only one wearing the bright pink tights, but I think all of us, we're here because there's something about this story that resonates. There's something about the story of life over death, of obeying God rather than human authority, that resonates with who we are. We, even here at Willow Avenue Mennonite Church, have lived into this. When we as a church said we look at the example of Jesus and see one who welcomes all and see that as a compelling way in which we too must welcome all, it was a way in which we as a church said we will obey God rather than human authority. And the human authorities might threaten our denominational affiliation. The human authorities might threaten our credentials. And yet we stand in this line of prophets throughout the ages who have said we must obey God rather than human authority. So what does this mean for us as individuals? I suspect that many of us are not likely going to be arrested. I suspect that many of us will not likely be performing miraculous healings that get us in trouble. But what are the choices that we can make? What are the ways that we, like the apostles who prayed for boldness, can find boldness in our own lives? What are the jobs and careers that we choose? And how do those choices show that we are obeying God rather than human authority? What are the ways in which we're spending our money and giving our funds to various corporations? How do those choices reflect our choice to obey God rather than human authority? And at the end of the day, where do we even find the courage to do this? Where does one go to find the boldness to proclaim these things? And here, I think, is where the words from Psalm 118 that Gary read for us can become an inspiration. What Psalm 118 proclaims is that the Lord is my strength and my might. The Lord has become my salvation. And friends, that is true. If the Lord is our strength and the Lord is our salvation, then obeying God rather than human authority means that we have access to that strength and that salvation. And this doesn't mean it will be easy. As we go on in Psalm 118, note the text here that is used to describe what can happen. Psalm 118, verse 22, the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Rejection is a part of that story. And in fact, it's from this text in Psalm 118 that Peter, in one of his speeches earlier in Acts, quotes and says, Jesus is that stone. Jesus is the one who has been rejected, and yet Jesus is the one who has become the chief cornerstone. And just as Jesus makes a choice for life in obeying God rather than human authority, we too, in the line of Jesus, as we seek to follow Jesus, we too choose to obey God rather than human authority in making a choice for life. And I think that means that we then can join our voice with that of the psalmist. Note how the psalmist concludes here in verse 29. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love endures forever. The Lord is good. God's steadfast love enduring forever means that as we obey God rather than human authority, we obey that choice for love. We obey that choice for life. May it be so.